In downtown Los Angeles, a silent janitor was about to discover the truth behind luxury car deals. Victory Autohaus buzzed with high-pressure sales when salesman Rico Valez began spinning elaborate lies about limited production vehicles and diplomatic paperwork exemptions. Steven Seagal wasn't your typical maintenance worker. For over 2 decades, he was a federal agent and martial arts expert, known for dismantling organized crime networks across 3 continents. When Rico bragged about making VIN numbers disappear and reappear, while claiming the FBI couldn't track their operations, he had no idea he was confessing federal crimes to the dealership's majority owner. Seagal's patient surveillance would trigger a coordinated federal takedown that would expose an international money laundering conspiracy. What began as rumors of automotive fraud would become a multi-state investigation. The gleaming showroom would never be the same after Rico learned the price of lying to Steven Seagal's face. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished concrete floor of Victory Autohaus as Steven Seagal pushed his maintenance cart through the gleaming showroom. The luxury car dealership sprawled across 3 city blocks in downtown Los Angeles, its glass walls reflecting the California sky like mirrors. Designed to hide what lay beneath, Seagal moved with deliberate quiet, his weathered hands gripping the mop handle as he observed everything and everyone around him. To the staff, he was just Steve, the new night janitor, a quiet older man who kept to himself and did his work without complaint. What they didn't know was that Steven Seagal now owned 51% of Victory Autohaus, having purchased his controlling stake through a shell company 3 weeks earlier. The rumors he'd heard about fraudulent operations at luxury dealerships across the city had led him here, and now he was going to see for himself just how deep the corruption ran. The showroom floor buzzed with activity. Even at 8 in the morning, Rico Valez stood near a gleaming red Ferrari, his perfectly styled hair catching the overhead lights as he gestured enthusiastically to a young couple who looked both dazzled and overwhelmed. Rico wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people. Made in a month, his smile was practiced, his movements fluid as he guided the couple around the vehicle like a predator circling prey. This beauty just arrived from Italy, Rico was saying, his voice carrying across the showroom floor. Limited production. Run only 50 made worldwide. You're looking at automotive history here. The young man nodded eagerly while his girlfriend shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting to the price tag that hung from the rearview mirror. Seagal continued mopping, moving closer to the conversation while maintaining the invisible presence he'd perfected during his years as a federal agent. Rico was in full sales mode now, explaining financing options that sounded too good to be true. 0% interest for qualified buyers, extended warranties that covered everything. Rico claimed no hidden fees, no surprises, just pure driving pleasure. But Seagal's trained ear caught the subtle misdirections, the way Rico glossed over certain terms and conditions. The financing paperwork he slid across the hood was thick, dense with legal language that would take a lawyer hours to parse through. The young couple, however, saw only the shiny surface, the dream car that could be theirs today if they just signed on the dotted line. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered for a moment, causing everyone to glance up nervously. When they steadied again, Seagal noticed something nobody else did. A service panel near the ceiling had shifted slightly during the power fluctuation, revealing the edge of what looked like additional wiring that shouldn't have been there. Security cameras were standard in dealerships, but this looked like something more sophisticated, something designed to monitor more than just theft. As the morning progressed, Seagal watched Rico work his magic on customer after customer. Each interaction followed the same pattern: dazzle with luxury appeal to emotion rush through paperwork. An elderly man inquired about a certified pre-owned Mercedes, only to leave 20 minutes later with financing papers for a car that cost twice his original budget. A single mother came in asking about reliable family vehicles, but somehow found herself signing a lease agreement for a sports car she clearly couldn't afford. During his lunch break, Seagal struck up a conversation with Miguel Herrera, the dealership's lead mechanic. Miggs was young, maybe 25, with calloused hands and oil stains on his work clothes that spoke of real mechanical knowledge. "Hey, Steve," Miggs said as Seagal approached the service bay. "You settling in okay around here?" Seagal nodded, keeping his response simple. Yeah, quiet place to work, good money. Miggs glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. It's quite all right, maybe too. Quiet sometimes. He paused as if weighing his words. You notice anything strange about some of these cars? Before Seagal could respond, Rico appeared at the service bay entrance, his smile bright, but his eyes sharp. Miguel, my friend, we need that Porsche. Detailed and ready for delivery this afternoon. Customer pickup at 4. Sure thing, Rico. Miggs replied, but there was tension in his voice, a forced casualness that Seagal immediately recognized, the kind of careful tone people used when they were afraid. Rico lingered for a moment, his gaze shifting between Miggs and Seagal. You're the new maintenance guy, right? What's your name again? Steve Johnson. Seagal replied, meeting Rico's stare with calm indifference. Well, Steve, welcome to Victory Autohaus. Rico said, extending a manicured hand. We run a tight ship here. Everyone pulls their weight. Everyone minds their own business. Understand? Seagal shook the offered hand, noting the expensive watch on Rico's wrist, the soft palms that had never done real work. Understood, he said simply. As Rico walked away, Miggs exhaled slowly, then looked at Seagal with something that might have been relief, or maybe warning. That man hears everything, sees everything. Just keep your head down, do your job, and don't ask questions. That's how you survive here. But Seagal wasn't interested in surviving. He was interested in the truth. And as he watched Rico return to the showroom floor to charm another unsuspecting customer, Seagal knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The hunt had begun. The dealership emptied slowly as evening settled over Los Angeles. The last customers had been ushered out by Rico and his team of junior salesmen, their laughter echoing off the showroom walls as they celebrated another record day. Seagal waited in the maintenance closet, listening to footsteps fade and car doors slam in the parking lot, until finally silence descended over Victory Autohaus like a blanket. At 11:30, Seagal emerged from his hiding spot. The security guard made his rounds every 2 hours, which gave him plenty of time to conduct his own investigation. He moved through the darkened showroom, his footsteps silent on the polished floor. The luxury vehicles sat like sleeping giants, their chrome and paint gleaming under the emergency lighting. He started with the red Ferrari that Rico had been pushing so aggressively that morning. Up close in the dim light, details became visible that hadn't been apparent during the day. The leather stitching on the seats was precise, but not quite right. The pattern was close to Ferrari standard, but the thread color was slightly off, something only someone familiar with authentic Italian craftsmanship would notice. Seagal pulled out a small LED flashlight and examined the dashboard. The serial numbers on various components did not match each other or the vehicle's VIN. The steering wheel bore the Ferrari logo, but the plastic felt cheap beneath his fingers, not the quality material Ferrari was known for. He popped the hood and photographed the engine bay with his phone. The block numbers had been ground down and re-stamped, a clear sign of tampering. Moving systematically through the showroom, Seagal inspected vehicle after vehicle. Each one told the same story: luxury cars that looked perfect from a distance, but revealed their secrets under close examination. A Lamborghini with aftermarket parts painted to look original, a Bentley with an engine that had clearly been rebuilt using non-factory components, a Maserati whose leather interior smelled of cheap adhesive rather than Italian craftsmanship. As he worked, Seagal began to understand the scope of the operation. Victory Autohaus wasn't just selling overpriced cars, they were selling elaborate counterfeits, vehicles that had been salvaged, rebuilt, and disguised to fool buyers who trusted the dealership's reputation. The level of deception was staggering, and it went far beyond simple fraud. This was organized crime disguised as legitimate business. Around midnight, Seagal heard voices outside the showroom and quickly extinguished his flashlight. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see Rico talking animatedly on his cell phone, pacing back and forth in the parking lot. Even through the glass, Seagal could see the tension in Rico's body language, his free hand gesturing sharply as he spoke. No, 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 Rico was saying, his voice rising. You don't understand. The margins on these units are already tight. If we have to eat another loss because of shipping delays, the whole operation suffers. Seagal's training kicked in, and he activated the voice recording app on his phone, moving closer to the window to catch more of the conversation. I don't care what it costs, Rico continued, just make sure the next shipment gets here clean. No more VIN problems, no more paperwork issues. My buyers are getting suspicious, and I can't afford to have them start asking the wrong questions. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Rico discussing delivery schedules, payment terms, and something called the Texas pipeline that made Seagal's blood run cold. When Rico finally ended the call and walked back toward the building, Seagal had already melted back into the shadows, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd heard, but his investigation was interrupted by an unexpected arrival. Headlights swept across the showroom as a battered SUV pulled into the parking lot. Seagal watched through the window as a woman got out of the vehicle, her movements sharp with anger. She tried the front door of the dealership, then began pounding on the glass, her voice muffled, but clearly upset. This had to be Naomi Brooks, the single mother had overheard Rico dismissing earlier that week. She had purchased a luxury SUV for her family only to have it break down within days of driving it off the lot. When she brought it back, Rico had smiled and explained that her warranty don't cover the specific type of engine failure she was experiencing, and that repairs would cost more than she had paid for the vehicle. Seagal watched as Naomi continued her futile assault on the locked door, her frustration evident in every gesture. Finally, she gave up and walked back to her SUV, but as she tried to start the engine, it sputtered and died. She tried again, with the same result. The vehicle that had cost her $30,000 and put her family deep in debt wouldn't even get her home. Without thinking, Seagal moved toward the rear exit of the building. By the time he reached the parking lot, Naomi was standing beside her SUV with tears of rage streaming down her face, her cell phone pressed to her ear as she tried to call for help. "Excuse me," Seagal said quietly, approaching her with his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. "You're having car trouble?" Naomi spun around, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. "Who are you? What do you want?" "Him, Steve. I work maintenance here," Seagal said, gesturing toward the building. "I saw you having problems. Thought maybe I could help." Naomi laughed bitterly. "Help? This piece of garbage has not run right since the day I bought it, and now it wants started all $30,000 for a lawn ornament." Seagal moved to the SUV and popped the hood. The engine bay told the same story. Had been seeing all night: cheap replacement parts disguised as premium components, an alternator that was barely functional, a cooling system that had been patched rather than properly repaired. "This vehicle had been designed to fail. Your SUV was sold to you under false pretenses," Seagal said quietly. "This isn't a luxury vehicle, it's a salvage car that was rebuilt with counterfeit parts." Naomi stared at him. "How do you know that?" "Because," Seagal replied, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made her listen, "I know what to look for, and what I see here is fraud." The next morning, Seagal arrived early at Victory Autohaus. The parking lot was nearly empty except for employee vehicles, and the service bay was quiet. Miguel Herrera was already at work, bent over the engine of a silver Porsche, his tools spread across a rolling cart. Beside him, Seagal approached slowly, making just enough noise to avoid startling the young mechanic. "Morning, Mig," Seagal said, setting down his maintenance supplies. Miguel looked up, his face showing the strain of a sleepless night. "Oh, hey, Steve, you're here early. Couldn't sleep," Seagal replied truthfully. "Mind if I ask you something?" Miguel glanced around nervously, then gestured for Seagal to come closer. "Sure, but keep your voice down. Management doesn't like the maintenance staff talking to mechanics during work hours." Seagal moved into the service bay, where the concrete walls would muffle their conversation. "That woman who was here yesterday, the one with the SUV, you know anything about her situation?" Miguel straightened, his expression growing serious. "Why you asking?" "Because her car died in the parking lot last night, and when I looked under the hood, I saw things that didn't make sense." Miguel was quiet for a long moment, his hands fidgeting with a wrench. Finally, he walked to a tool cabinet in the corner of the bay and pulled out a manila folder from behind a stack of shop manuals. Inside were dozens of documents, invoices, work orders, and photographs. "You want to know about that woman's car?" Miguel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is what you need to see." Seagal examined the contents of the folder. The paperwork told a disturbing story: vehicles purchased at salvage auctions for a few $1,000s, then rebuilt using counterfeit parts and sold as certified pre-owned luxury cars. The invoices showed payments to companies with names like Premium Auto Restoration and Elite Vehicle Services, but the addresses were all the same warehouse complex in East Los Angeles. "This Porsche I'm working on right now," Miguel continued, "it's supposed to be a 2020 model with 12,000 miles. But look at this." He pointed to the engine block. "The casting numbers say it's from 2016. And check out these brake rotors. They're aftermarket Chinese knockoffs painted to look like Brembo originals." "How long has this been going on?" Seagal asked. Miguel shrugged. "At least 2 years, maybe longer. I started documenting everything after I realized what was happening. Figured someday somebody would need proof." "Why haven't you gone to the police?" Miguel laughed bitterly. "You think I didn't try? I called the fraud hotline 6 months ago. You know what happened 2 days later?" Rico called me into his office and asked if I was happy with my job here. He never said anything direct, but the message was clear: keep quiet or find another job. Seagal understood the young man's position. Miguel had family responsibilities, a sick mother, younger siblings who depended on his income. Going up against Rico and whatever organization backed him wasn't just risky, it was potentially deadly. But something else was bothering Seagal about the situation. Where do the cars come from originally, I mean? Before they're rebuilt, that's the scary part. Miguel said the salvage yards are just the beginning. Some of these vehicles were in serious accidents, totaled cars that should never be on the road again. But others, he paused, looking around nervously. Others come from a pipeline that runs through Mexico, stolen cars that get chopped up and rebuilt with new. Vince Seagal felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just fraud, it was part of a larger criminal enterprise that stretched across international borders, the kind of operation that required serious backing and serious protection. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing through the service bay. Rico Valez appeared in the entrance, his usual smile in place, but his eyes cold and calculating. Miguel, my friend Rico, said, his voice carrying a slight edge. How are we doing with the Porsche this morning? Customer pickup is at 2 o'clock sharp. Almost finished, Rico. Miguel replied quickly. The engine tune-up is complete. Just doing a final inspection. Excellent, Rico said. Then his gaze shifted to Seagal. And Steve, isn't it what brings you to the service bay this morning? Just emptying the trash cans, Seagal replied, indicating the cleaning cart beside him. Well, don't let me keep you from your work, Rico said, but make sure you stay in your designated areas. We have expensive equipment back here, and insurance doesn't cover damage caused by unauthorized personnel. As Rico walked away, Miguel exhaled slowly, then looked at Seagal with genuine fear in his eyes. That man has eyes everywhere, cameras, microphones, informants among the staff. If he suspects we were talking about anything more than the weather, we'll both be in serious trouble. But Seagal wasn't intimidated by Rico Valez or whoever was backing him. He had faced down worse men in darker places and lived to tell about it. What concerned him was the scope of the operation and the number of innocent people being victimized. That afternoon, Seagal witnessed another piece of the puzzle fall into place. An elderly man named Clarence Donnelly shuffled into the showroom, wearing a Vietnam veteran's baseball cap and a plaid shirt that had seen better days. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on a walking cane, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Clarence had been saving for 3 years to buy his dream car, a classic Mustang convertible that reminded him of the car he had owned before shipping out to Vietnam in 1968. Rico greeted him with enthusiasm and led him to a beautiful red Mustang that sat prominently in the center of the showroom. Seagal watched from a distance as Rico explained the car's features, its pristine condition, its authenticated originality, its reasonable price for such a rare find. Clarence nodded eagerly, his face lighting up with joy as he imagined himself behind the wheel. But when Clarence mentioned a rattling sound he'd noticed during the test drive, Rico dismissed his concerns with a wave of his hand. That's just the classic car charm, he said. All vintage vehicles have their little quirks, gives them character. Besides, the sound will disappear once the engine gets properly broken in. Seagal knew that rattling sound was likely a sign of serious engine problems, possibly a failing timing chain or worn bearings, the kind of issues that could leave Clarence stranded on the side of the road, or worse, cause a catastrophic failure while driving. As he watched Rico pressure the elderly veteran into signing financing papers that would put him deep in debt for a vehicle that was likely to break down within months, Seagal felt something inside him snap. This wasn't just business anymore, it was personal, and Rico Valez was about to learn what happened when predators targeted the innocent 3 nights later. Seagal followed a delivery truck as it wound through the industrial section of East Los Angeles, keeping his distance in a nondescript sedan he'd rented under an assumed name. The truck had left Victory Autohaus around midnight loaded with what the shipping manifest claimed were automotive parts, but Seagal suspected the cargo was far more significant than spare brake pads and oil filters. The truck eventually pulled into a warehouse complex surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with razor wire. The buildings were dark except for one structure at the far end of the lot, where lights spilled from high windows and the sound of machinery hummed through the night air. Seagal parked several blocks away and approached on foot, using the shadows and abandoned vehicles scattered around the area for cover. The warehouse was bigger than it appeared from the street, easily large enough to house a full automotive assembly operation. Seagal found a service ladder bolted to the exterior wall and climbed carefully to a row of windows that ran along the building's upper level. What he saw through the grimy glass made his blood run cold. The warehouse floor was set up like a professional chop shop, but instead of stealing cars, they were building them. Dozens of vehicle frames sat in various stages of assembly, while workers installed engines, transmissions, and body panels. The operation was sophisticated and well organized, with each station specializing in a specific aspect of the rebuilding process. But it was the two men standing near a makeshift office in the corner of the warehouse that captured Seagal's attention. Rico Valez was there, his usual confident demeanor replaced by obvious nervous tension, pacing back and forth as he spoke with a man in an expensive suit who radiated the kind of quiet authority that came from real power. Seagal activated his phone's camera and began recording as much as possible. The suited man was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and the kind of face that never showed emotion. His clothes were impeccable, but his hands bore the calluses and scars of someone who had done physical work earlier in his life. Everything about him suggested old-school organized crime with a modern corporate veneer. "We need to discuss the quarterly projections," the man was saying, his voice carrying clearly. "In the warehouse area, your retail operation is showing good numbers, but the margins are tighter than we projected." Rico nodded, quickly mopping sweat from his forehead despite the cool night air. "The problem is customer retention, Leo. Some of these rebuilt units are failing faster than expected, and when buyers come back for warranty work, it cuts into our profits." Leo, the name stuck in Seagal's mind as he continued recording. This had to be Leo Stacks Bernard, the money man behind the operation. Leo stepped closer to Rico, his voice dropping to a more threatening tone. "Let me explain something to you, Rico. We're not in the car business, we're in the money laundering business. These vehicles are just a convenient way to process dirty cash through legitimate-looking transactions. If the cars fall apart after sale, that's the buyer's problem, not ours. But if too many people start complaining," Rico protested, "it draws attention from regulators, insurance companies, maybe even law enforcement. Then make sure they don't complain." Leo replied coldly, "There are ways to discourage unhappy customers from making noise. Use your imagination." Seagal felt his jaw clench as he listened to the casual discussion of intimidating victims, people like Naomi Brooks and Clarence Donnelly, who had trusted Victory Autohaus with their life savings and were now facing financial ruin because of their greed. The conversation continued with Leo outlining expansion plans for the operation. They were looking to open similar dealerships in San Diego, Phoenix, and Las Vegas, creating a network of fraudulent businesses that could process millions of dollars in illegal funds while maintaining the appearance of legitimate commerce. Rico pulled out a tablet and began showing Leo spreadsheets and charts detailing the operation's finances. The numbers were staggering. Victory Autohaus alone was generating over $2 million in revenue per month, with profit margins that would make legitimate businesses jealous. The rebuilt vehicles cost between $3,000 and $5,000 to assemble, but were being sold for $30,000 to $50,000 each. But Leo wasn't satisfied with the current scope of the operation. He wanted to double production within 6 months, which would require additional warehouse space, more skilled workers, and a larger inventory of salvaged vehicles to rebuild. "That's where the Texas pipeline comes in," Leo explained. "We have contacts in Houston and Dallas who can provide us with a steady stream of flood-damaged vehicles, insurance write-offs that can be purchased for pennies on the dollar and rebuilt here in Los Angeles." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rico looked nervous about the expansion timeline, but Leo made it clear that objections weren't welcome. This was an order, not a discussion. The meeting concluded with Leo handing Rico an envelope that appeared to contain cash along with instructions for a pickup scheduled for the following week. As the two men prepared to leave the warehouse, Seagal carefully climbed down from his perch and made his way back to his car. The evidence he had gathered was substantial, but he knew it wasn't enough to bring down the entire operation. He needed more proof, more documentation, and most importantly, he needed to ensure that the victims would be protected. When the hammer finally fell, driving back through the empty streets of Los Angeles, Seagal thought about his next moves. He had the names Leo Stacks Bernard and Rico Valez, along with the warehouse location and photographic evidence of the rebuilding operation. But organized crime networks like this one had layers of protection: lawyers, accountants, and corrupt officials who could make evidence disappear and witnesses change their stories. What he needed was someone inside law enforcement who could be trusted someone with the authority and resources to build a case that would stick. Detective Anya Chun had been his partner years ago during his time with the Federal Task Force investigating organized crime. They had worked well together. And more importantly, she was one of the few cops he had ever met who couldn't be bought or intimidated. As he pulled into his hotel parking lot, Seagal made the decision to reach out to Anya in the morning. It was time to turn his lone wolf investigation into a coordinated law enforcement operation, but first he had to make sure that the victims at the center of this case would be ready to testify. When the time came, Naomi Brooks, Miguel Herrera, and Clarence Donnelly were about to become key players in bringing down one of the most sophisticated fraud operations the city had ever seen. But they would need protection, guidance, and most importantly, the knowledge that someone was finally fighting for them. Rico Valez and Leo Stax Bernard had built their empire on the assumption that their victims would remain silent, isolated, and ashamed of being fooled, but they had made a critical error in judgment. They had lied to the wrong man, and Steven Seagal was about to show them the price of deception. Detective Anya Chun sat across from Seagal in a downtown diner that served coffee strong enough to wake the dead, her dark eyes studying the photographs and documents he had spread across the table between them. She hadn't changed much in the 5 years since they had worked together, still sharp, still uncompromising, still the kind of cop who would rather break than bend. This is impressive, Steven, she said finally, her voice carrying the respect of someone who understood the risks he had taken to gather this evidence. But you know as well as I do that what we have here is mostly circumstantial. We need more solid proof, something that will hold up in court against the kind of lawyers these people can afford. Seagal nodded. He had expected this response. Anya was thorough, methodical, the kind of investigator who built cases like architects built skyscrapers, with careful attention to every detail that would support the final structure. What do you need? Bank records, financial statements, direct evidence of money laundering, Anya replied. And most importantly, we need victims who are willing to testify, people who can put human faces on these crimes and make a jury understand the real impact of what these criminals have done. That evening, Seagal visited Naomi Brooks at her modest apartment in Koreatown. She lived on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better days, but her small home was clean and organized, a testament to her determination to provide stability for her 8-year-old daughter despite the financial chaos that Victory Autohaus had brought into her life. Naomi opened the door cautiously, keeping the security chain in place until she recognized him. Then she let him in, her movements quick and nervous. You're that maintenance guy from the dealership, she said. What are you doing here? My name is Steven Seagal, he said quietly, and I'm not really a maintenance worker. I'm investigating Victory Autohaus, and I think you can help me shut them down. Naomi stared at him for a long moment, then laughed bitterly. You're kidding, right? Some kind of undercover cop or something like that, Seagal replied. He explained his real identity and his investigation, carefully watching her face as she processed the information. When he finished, she was quiet for several minutes. You want me to trust you, she said finally. After Rico and his people have already destroyed my credit, ruined my savings, and left me with a car that barely runs, why should I believe anything you say? Because Seagal said simply, I can prove that what happened to you was part of a systematic fraud operation, and I can help you get justice, not just for yourself, but for dozens of other victims. Over the next hour, Seagal showed Naomi the evidence he had gathered, the photographs from the warehouse, the financial documents that Miggs had provided, and the recordings of Rico and Leo discussing their criminal enterprise. Her anger grew as she realized the scope of the deception. They knew, Naomi said, her voice shaking with rage. They knew that SUV was going to break down. They sold it to me anyway, knowing I would be stuck with the debt and no way to get my money back. That's exactly right, Seagal confirmed. And you're not alone. There are others just like you, people who trusted Victory Autohaus and got cheated. But if we work together, we can make them pay for what they've done. Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at her daughter's school photo on the mantle. I can't afford to lose my job, she said. If I testify against them, they might try to get me fired or worse. Seagal understood her fear, but he also knew that her testimony would be crucial to building a case that could actually succeed in court. You'll have protection, he promised. Detective Chun is already working on witness security protocols. And once we have enough evidence, the district attorney will be able to offer you immunity and other protections. What do you need me to do? Naomi asked. First, we need to document everything about your purchase, the original contract, the financing Paperwork, any communications you had with Rico or his staff, Seagal explained. Then we need you to help us identify other victims, people who bought cars from Victory Autohaus and had similar experiences. Naomi nodded slowly. I know at least 3 other people from my neighborhood who bought cars there. One of them is a single father like me. His car died 2 weeks after he bought it, and now he's facing repossession. Perfect, Seagal said. That kind of pattern will be crucial evidence. Can you put me in touch with them? Over the following days, Seagal worked methodically to build a comprehensive victim database. With Naomi's help, he identified 17 people who had purchased vehicles from Victory Autohaus in the past 18 months. Each story was variations on the same theme: high-pressure sales tactics, predatory financing terms, and vehicles that failed catastrophically within weeks or months of purchase. The financial documents told an even more disturbing story. Most of the victims had been targeted specifically because of their vulnerable situations: single parents, recent immigrants, elderly people on fixed incomes, and young adults with limited credit history. Rico and his team had developed profiles of ideal marks, people who would be dazzled by the promise of luxury but lacked the resources or knowledge to fight back when things went wrong. Meanwhile, Detective Chun was working her own angles, using Seagal's evidence to obtain search warrants and subpoenas for Victory Autohaus financial records. The paper trail was beginning to reveal the sophisticated money laundering operation that Leo Stacks Bernard had constructed using the dealership as a front, but their investigation hit an unexpected snag. When Miggs called Seagal in a panic, Rico knows something's up, he said, his voice barely audible over the phone. He's been asking questions about you, specifically wants to know why you're always hanging around the service bay and whether I've been talking to you about anything other than maintenance work. Seagal felt a chill run down his spine. If Rico was becoming suspicious, it meant their time was running out. The criminal organization would start covering its tracks, destroying evidence, and possibly eliminating witnesses who could testify against them. Stay calm, Seagal told Miggs. Just do your job and don't give him any reason to think you're involved in anything. We're almost ready to move. But as he hung up the phone, Seagal knew that almost ready might not be good enough. Rico Valez was about to force their hand, and the final confrontation was approaching faster than anyone had anticipated. The morning air was thick with Los Angeles smog as Seagal pushed his maintenance cart through Victory Autohaus, but something felt different today. There was tension in the building, a nervous energy that seemed to emanate from Rico and his sales team. Hushed conversations stopped when he walked by, and he noticed security cameras that seemed to track his movements more carefully than before. Rico stood near the entrance, talking quietly with 2 men in dark suits who looked like they had stepped out of a mobster movie. Their presence sent ripples of unease through the staff, and Seagal recognized the signs of an organization that was preparing for trouble, the kind of trouble that usually ended with people disappearing around noon. A gleaming silver McLaren arrived on a transport truck, its sleek lines and aggressive styling immediately drawing attention from both staff and customers. Rico personally supervised its unloading, directing the driver to position it prominently in the center of the showroom, where it would catch the eye of anyone entering the building. Seagal watched from a distance as Rico inspected every inch of the vehicle, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something approaching nervousness. He was clearly under pressure to move high-value inventory quickly, which suggested that Leo Stacks Bernard was tightening the screws on the operation. That afternoon, Rico approached Seagal directly, something he had never done before. His smile was in place, but his eyes were cold and calculating. Steve, he said, my maintenance friend, I want to show you something special. We just received this McLaren 720S, absolutely pristine condition, straight from the factory. Seagal followed Rico to the McLaren, maintaining his cover as the simple janitor who wouldn't know a McLaren from a Honda, but internally, he was already analyzing every detail of the vehicle. From 20 feet away, he could see telltale signs of reconstruction work: paint that didn't quite match between panels, interior components that looked slightly off, and tires that were definitely not original equipment. This beauty, Rico said, running his hand along the car's flank, is worth $400,000, but I'm going to let it go for $325. That's practically giving it away. And between you and me, he leaned closer conspiratorially, this car has some interesting history. Oh really? Seagal replied, keeping his voice neutral and uninterested. Rico grinned widely. This McLaren was involved in a little incident down in Mexico, nothing serious, just some paperwork complications, but we were able to clean everything up. Make It completely legal, you understand what I'm saying? Seagal understood perfectly. Rico was telling him that the car was stolen, probably from Mexico, and had been given a new identity through forged documents, the kind of confession that would be worth its weight in gold if he could get it recorded. Tell me more about this paperwork situation, Seagal said, pretending to be impressed by Rico's criminal connections. Rico looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then leaned even closer. Let's just say we have people who are very good at making VIN numbers disappear and reappear somewhere else better than the feds at it. Actually, the FBI couldn't track this car if they had a team of agents working on it for a year. There it was, the lie that crossed every line. Rico had just confessed to federal crimes involving stolen vehicles, falsified government documents, and obstruction of justice, while bragging about being able to outwit federal law enforcement. The arrogance was breathtaking. But it was also exactly what Seagal needed to hear. Rico continued his boasting, explaining how the operation moved stolen luxury vehicles across the border, processed them through the warehouse facility, and created completely new identities for them before selling them to unsuspecting buyers. He described the process with pride, as if he were explaining a legitimate business innovation rather than organized crime. Very impressive, Seagal said. When Rico finished his explanation, you've really thought of everything. Rico beamed with satisfaction. I didn't get where I am by being careless, Steve. Every detail matters. Every angle has to be covered. That's why this operation is bulletproof. Seagal nodded and walked away, his expression unchanged. But inside, he was calculating the final steps of the takedown. Rico had just handed him the confession that would bring down the entire criminal enterprise. But more importantly, he had revealed the depth of his arrogance and contempt for both the law and his victims. That evening, Seagal met with Detective Chun in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner far from Victory Autohaus. The conversation had been recorded on his phone, and Anya listened to it twice before speaking. This is it, she said. Finally, this is what we need. Rico just confessed to multiple federal crimes and implicated Leo in the process. We can move forward with arrests. But Seagal shook his head. Not yet. We need to protect the witnesses first. Rico is getting suspicious. And if we move too quickly, he might try to silence people like Naomi and Miggs before they can testify. Anya understood the concern. Organized crime operations didn't hesitate to eliminate threats, and civilian witnesses were particularly vulnerable. I can arrange protection, she said, but it will take a few days to set up properly. We don't have a few days, Seagal replied. Rico is already asking questions, and those men in suits who were at the dealership today, they weren't there to buy cars. They were there to clean up loose ends. Later that night, Miggs called Seagal again, his voice tight with fear. Rico came to my apartment. He said, told me he was concerned about my well-being, wanted to make sure I understood how dangerous it could be for a young man like me to get involved in things that were none of his business. Seagal felt his patience finally snap. Rico Valez had crossed the line from fraud to intimidation and was now threatening innocent people who had done nothing more than try to earn an honest living. The time for careful investigation and methodical evidence gathering was over. Tomorrow, Seagal told Miggs, we're going to end this, but I need you to do exactly what I tell you. No questions, no hesitation. Can you handle that? Miggs was quiet for a moment. Then his voice strengthened with resolve. What do you need me to do? The final confrontation was less than 24 hours away, and Steven Seagal was ready to show Rico Valez and Leo Stax Bernard what happened when predators threatened innocent people. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The small apartment in Koreatown felt like a sanctuary as Clarence Pop Donnelly sat in his worn leather recliner, the Vietnam veteran's cap perched on his gray head, while he sipped coffee from a mug that read World's Greatest. Grandpa Seagal sat across from him on a faded couch, listening as the old soldier shared stories that carried the weight of decades. You know, son, Pop said, his voice carrying the careful cadence of someone who had learned to choose his words carefully. After 60 years of living, I've seen enough liars in my time to recognize one when he's standing right in front of me. That Rico fellow at the dealership, he reminds me of a supply sergeant we had in Saigon back in '68. Seagal leaned forward, interested in the parallel. Go on, Sergeant Morrison was his name. Pop continued, his eyes focused on something far beyond the walls of the small apartment. Smooth talker, just like your Rico, always had a deal for you, always knew where to get things that were hard to find. Problem was half the stuff he sold was stolen from other units, and the other half was worthless junk painted to look like the real thing. Sounds familiar, Seagal said. Pop nodded grimly. Morrison got away with it for months because he was careful, never took too much from any one place never got too greedy, but eventually he made a mistake, tried to sell some faulty ammunition to a unit that was heading out on patrol. The ammunition failed during a firefight, and good men died. Because of his greed, what happened? To Morrison, Pop was quiet for a moment, then looked directly at Seagal. The men in his unit took care of it themselves. Military justice can be swift and final when innocent lives are at stake. The weight of that statement hung in the air between them. Seagal understood that Pop was telling him more than just a war story. He was explaining why some battles had to be fought regardless of the personal cost. Rico sold me that Mustang knowing it would break down, Pop said finally, just like Morrison sold that bad ammunition knowing it would fail when we needed it most. The only difference is Morrison was stealing from soldiers who knew the risks. Rico is stealing from people who trust him. To be honest, Seagal studied the elderly veteran's face, seeing the resolve that had carried him through combat and decades of civilian life afterward. Would you be willing to tell that story publicly to help stop Rico from hurting other people? Pop was quiet for several minutes. Then he reached into a drawer beside his chair and pulled out a small metal object. It was a bronze star medal tarnished with age, but still bearing the inscription for heroic achievement in combat. This belonged to my best friend Jimmy Chun. He died in that firefight with the bad ammunition. Seagal repeated the name, striking a chord. Pop's eyes sharpened. Jimmy had a daughter, little girl named Anya. She became a police officer like her daddy. Always wanted to be. Small world, isn't it? Seagal felt the pieces clicking into place. Detective Anya Chun was the daughter of Pop's fallen comrade, which explained the passion and integrity that drove her work in law enforcement. It also meant that this case had personal stakes for her that went far beyond professional duty. Jimmy died because someone put profit ahead of honor, Pop continued, and now his daughter spends her life trying to make sure other people don't suffer the same way. If testifying against Rico will help Anya get justice for her father's memory, then that's what he'll do. The next morning, Pop appeared on a local news program, his lined face calm and dignified as he told his story to reporter Sarah Martinez. The interview was powerful and heartbreaking. An elderly veteran explaining how he had saved for 3 years to buy his dream car, only to be cheated by a predatory dealership that sold him a vehicle designed to fail. I served my country for 2 tours in Vietnam, Pop said, looking directly into the camera. Came home and worked 40 years in a factory, saved every penny I could because I wanted to own something beautiful, something that would remind me of better times. Instead, I got lies and a car that broke down 2 weeks after I bought it. The story went viral within hours. Social media exploded with outrage as viewers shared Pop's interview and demanded action against Victory Autohaus. The hashtag Justice for Pop began trending, and other victims started coming forward with their own stories of being cheated by the dealership. Rico watched the news coverage from his office at Victory Autohaus, his face growing paler with each passing minute. His phone was ringing constantly as reporters requested interviews and potential customers demanded explanations. Several major automotive websites picked up the story, and Victory Autohaus found itself under a microscope that revealed every flaw in its operation. By evening, the dealership was surrounded by protesters carrying signs that read "Honesty, not fraud" and "Veterans deserve better." Local television crews set up outside the building, broadcasting live updates. As more victims joined the growing crowd, Leo Stax Bernard was not pleased with the publicity. Rico received a phone call that lasted less than 2 minutes, but left him shaking when he hung up. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, and the money behind the operation was losing patience with his inability to contain the damage inside. The dealership. Panic was spreading among the staff. Several junior salesmen had already called in sick, afraid to face the angry crowd outside. Miggs worked quietly in the service bay, but he could feel the tension building like pressure in a boiler that was ready to explode. That night, Seagal visited Pop one final time, bringing with him a copy of the Bronze Star citation that had belonged to Jimmy Chun. Detective Chun had kept it all these years and had asked Seagal to share it with the man who had served alongside her father. Pop read the citation carefully, then looked up at Seagal with tears in his eyes. "Jimmy was the best man I ever knew," he said. "If Anya is half the person her father was, then Rico and his friends are in serious trouble tomorrow," Seagal said quietly. "We're going to finish this. Are you ready?" Pop straightened in his chair, and for a moment Seagal could see the young soldier who had served his country with honor and courage. "I've been ready for 50 years, son. The question is whether Rico is ready for what comes next." The stage was set for the final confrontation, And Steven Seagal knew that when morning came, Rico Valez would face a reckoning that had been building since the first lie he had told and the first victim he had cheated justice was coming, and it would be swift and unforgiving. Dawn broke gray and overcast across Los Angeles, as if the city itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Seagal sat in his rental car across the street from Victory Autohaus, watching the dealership prepare for what Rico hoped would be a normal business day, but there was nothing normal about the tension that seemed to radiate from the building like heat from asphalt. Naomi Brooks checked her appearance in the bathroom mirror of a coffee shop 6 blocks away. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Detective Chun had briefed her carefully on what to expect, but no amount of preparation could completely eliminate the fear of walking back into the lion's den. The wire she wore was practically invisible, a tiny microphone clipped inside her jacket collar, and a transmitter no larger than a deck of cards tucked into her purse. The technology would capture every word of her conversation, with Rico providing the final piece of evidence needed to bring down the entire operation. At 8:30, Naomi entered Victory Autohaus and was immediately greeted by Rico, who seemed genuinely surprised to see her. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, his practiced smile snapping into place, "what brings you back to see us today? I thought we had resolved all the issues with your vehicle." "Actually," Naomi replied, "I wanted to discuss upgrading to something newer. My financial situation has improved, and am interested in trading up to a luxury sedan, maybe something German." Rico's eyes lit up with the prospect of another commission. "Excellent choice," he said, steering her toward a gleaming BMW that sat prominently near the front window. "This 7 Series is perfect for a discriminating buyer like yourself. Fully loaded leather interior, premium sound system, and most importantly, a financing package that will fit your budget." As Rico launched into his sales presentation, Seagal entered the dealership through the service entrance, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who belonged there. He wore his maintenance uniform and carried a clipboard that would make him invisible to anyone not looking closely, but his eyes were alert, cataloging every detail of the building's layout and the positions of Rico security personnel. Miguel was waiting for him in the service bay, his face pale but determined. "You sure about this, Steve?" he asked quietly. "Because once we start this, there's no going back." Seagal nodded grimly. Rico made his choice when he decided to threaten innocent people. Now, he gets to live with the consequences. In the showroom, Rico was explaining the BMW's financing options to Naomi, his voice smooth and confident as he outlined terms that sounded reasonable, but were actually designed to trap her in a predatory loan cycle. The monthly payments he quoted were artificially low, but the contract included balloon payments and adjustable interest rates that would eventually bankrupt her. "This particular vehicle," Rico said, running his hand along the BMW's hood, "has some special advantages. The previous owner was a diplomat who brought it in from Germany, so it has certain paperwork exemptions that make it very affordable for the right buyer." Naomi played her part, perfectly expressing interest and asking the kinds of questions that a naive buyer might ask. But Seagal could hear the subtle probing in her voice as she tried to get Rico to admit more about the car's questionable origins. Meanwhile, Detective Chen sat in an unmarked van 2 blocks away, listening to every word through high-quality headphones. She had 3 teams of officers positioned around the dealership ready to move when Seagal gave the signal, but timing would be crucial. They needed Rico to incriminate himself completely before making their move. The tension in the dealership was becoming palpable. Rico sensed something was wrong, but couldn't identify the source of his unease. He kept glancing toward the service bay where unusual activity seemed to be taking place, and his 2 security guards were more alert than usual, their hands resting casually near concealed weapons. Seagal used the building's security system against itself, moving through areas covered by cameras, but staying in blind spots that he had identified during his weeks of observation. When he reached the main electrical panel, he made a small adjustment that would disable the building's locks and alarm system. When the time came back in the showroom, Rico was pressing Naomi to sign the financing papers, his usual patience replaced by an urgency that suggested he wanted to close the deal quickly and get her out of the building. But Naomi continued to ask questions about the car's history and the financing terms. "Actually," Rico said, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge, "this is a limited time offer. The financing package I'm offering you today might not be available tomorrow. If you're serious about this car, I need you to make a decision now." That's when Seagal emerged from the service area and walked calmly across the showroom floor, his maintenance uniform and clipboard, making him practically invisible until he was standing directly behind Rico. Excuse me, Seagal said quietly. Rico spun around, his face showing surprise and the beginning of suspicion. Steve, what are you doing on the sales floor? You're supposed to be working in the back. Actually, Seagal said, his voice carrying a new authority that made everyone in the showroom turn to look at him. My name is Steven Seagal, and I own 51% of this dealership. Rico stared at him in shock, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The confession he had made just days earlier suddenly taking on terrifying new significance. Mrs. Brooks, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, I think there may be some misunderstanding here. There's no misunderstanding, Seagal replied calmly. You've been selling counterfeit vehicles, running predatory loan schemes, and threatening witnesses, and now you're going to answer for all of it. Rico reached for something inside his jacket, but Seagal was already moving, the years of training and experience compressed into a single fluid motion that ended with Rico on the ground gasping for breath while his two security guards found themselves facing a man who moved like violence personified. The first guard reached for his weapon, but Seagal was already there, his hand closing on the man's wrist with crushing force. The gun clattered across the showroom floor as the guard screamed in pain, his wrist broken in 3 places. The second guard tried to run, but found himself lifted off his feet and thrown through a display case that shattered with the sound of breaking glass. It was over in less than 30 seconds. Rico and his enforcers neutralized with surgical precision and minimal collateral damage. Seagal stood in the center of the showroom, breathing normally, while around him the evidence of his swift justice sparkled like diamonds on the floor. Naomi looked at him with something approaching awe, then spoke clearly into her wire. Detective Chun, this is Naomi Brooks. You can move in now. Steven Seagal has secured the scene. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second, and Rico Valez finally understood that his empire of lies was about to become a memory. The sirens reached a crescendo as Detective Anya Chun led a convoy of police vehicles that surrounded Victory Autohaus like a military operation. The coordinated timing was flawless. Unmarked cars blocked every exit while uniformed officers moved with practiced efficiency to secure the perimeter. The dealership that had operated as a criminal enterprise for years was finally under siege. Inside the showroom, Rico Valez sat on the floor, clutching his ribs, where Seagal's precise strike had left him gasping for breath. His two security guards were immobilized, one cradling a shattered wrist, while the other lay unconscious among the remains of a shattered display case. The transformation from predatory confidence to helpless defeat had taken less than 5 minutes. Seagal stood calmly in the center of the chaos, his maintenance uniform now seeming almost absurd given the authority he radiated. Naomi Brooks remained near the BMW that had been the centerpiece of their sting operation, her wire still transmitting every word to the police teams that were now flooding into the building. Detective Chun entered through the main entrance, her weapon drawn but lowered when she saw that Seagal had already neutralized the immediate threats. Steven, she said with professional respect, nice work. As always, the scene is secure from our end. Simultaneous raids were taking place across the city. Federal agents had descended on the warehouse complex in East Los Angeles, where the vehicle rebuilding operation was centered, while other teams were executing search warrants at Leo Stacks Bernard's financial offices and personal residences. The coordinated strike was designed to prevent the destruction of evidence and the escape of key players. Rico finally found his voice, though it came out as a raspy whisper. This is harassment, he wheezed. I want my lawyer. You have no right to assault me in my own business. Actually, Seagal replied, his tone matter of fact. This is my business. I own controlling interest in Victory Autohaus, which makes you my employee, and what I just witnessed was an employee attempting to defraud a customer while threatening violence against witnesses. Detective Chun pulled out her handcuffs and approached Rico, who was still struggling to breathe normally. Rico Valez, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, intimidation of witnesses, and conspiracy to traffic stolen vehicles. She began reading him his Miranda rights while uniformed officers moved to secure the 2 injured security guards, but the real prize was happening simultaneously across town. Federal agents had cornered Leo Stacks Bernard in his Beverly Hills office, where he was frantically trying to delete computer files and shred financial documents. The sophisticated money laundering operation that had used Victory Autohaus as its front was being dismantled piece by piece. Leo had underestimated the scope of the investigation, assuming that his layers of shell companies and offshore accounts would protect him from law enforcement, but Seagal's methodical evidence gathering had provided prosecutors with a roadmap through the financial maze that Leo had constructed over years of criminal enterprise. At the warehouse complex, federal agents were documenting an operation that was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Dozens of luxury vehicles in various stages of reconstruction filled the main building, while a secondary facility housed sophisticated equipment for manufacturing counterfeit vehicle identification numbers and forging government documents. Miguel Herrera led investigators through the rebuilding process, explaining how salvaged vehicles were transformed into convincing replicas of high-end cars. His folder of documentation proved invaluable as federal agents began tracing the sources of the stolen and damaged vehicles that formed the foundation of the criminal enterprise. The scope of the operation was staggering. Investigators found evidence linking Victory Autohaus to similar dealerships in Phoenix, Las Vegas, and San Diego, creating a network that had processed hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions over the past 3 years. The money trail led through banks in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Luxembourg, revealing an international conspiracy that reached far beyond Los Angeles. Back at the dealership, local news crews had arrived and were broadcasting live coverage of the arrests. The footage of Rico being led away in handcuffs while Seagal stood quietly in the background became iconic, representing the triumph of justice over organized greed. The story dominated local news cycles and quickly went national as reporters recognized the broader implications. Clarence "Pop" Donnelly arrived at the dealership just as Rico was being loaded into a police van. The elderly veteran stood with quiet dignity, watching the man who had cheated him face the consequences of his actions. Pop had brought with him a group of other victims, people who had responded to his television interview by sharing their own stories of being defrauded by Victory Autohaus. The gathering of victims created a powerful visual for the news cameras: elderly veterans, single mothers, young families, and working-class people who had trusted Victory Autohaus with their life savings and been betrayed. Their presence transformed the arrest from a simple law enforcement action into a statement about corporate responsibility and the protection of vulnerable consumers. Naomi Brooks found herself surrounded by reporters who wanted to know about her role in the investigation. She handled the attention with grace, explaining how Seagal's investigation had given her hope that justice was possible even for ordinary people who had been victimized by sophisticated criminals. "I was ready to give up," she told one reporter. "My credit was ruined, my car was worthless, and I thought there was nothing I could do." But Steven Seagal showed me that sometimes one person willing to fight for what is right can make all the difference. As the afternoon progressed, the full scope of the evidence became clear. Prosecutors announced that Rico faced federal charges that could result in 20 years in prison, while Leo Stax Bernard was being held without bail on money laundering and racketeering charges that carried potential life sentences. The financial impact on victims was also being addressed. The federal government was prepared to seize assets from the criminal enterprise and establish a victim compensation fund that would help people like Naomi and Pop recover their losses. The luxury vehicles in the dealership showroom would be auctioned, with proceeds going to the compensation fund. Miguel Herrera was granted full immunity in exchange for his cooperation with federal investigators. His documentation had been crucial to building the case, and his willingness to testify would help ensure that the prosecutions were successful rather than face criminal charges. Miggs would be able to start fresh with a clean record and the gratitude of law enforcement. As evening approached, Seagal finally removed his maintenance uniform and emerged from the dealership in his normal clothes. The transformation was startling. The quiet janitor, who had been invisible for weeks, was revealed as someone who commanded respect through presence alone. Detective Chin approached him as he prepared to leave the scene. "I have to ask," she said, "how did you know this would work?" Rico could have had more security backup plans, escape routes. Seagal considered the question carefully, then replied, "Men like Rico always underestimate their opponents. They see only what they expect to see. A janitor instead of an investigator, a victim instead of someone who fights back. Their arrogance becomes their weakness." The final arrests continued through the night as federal agents rounded up the remaining members of the criminal network. Bank records led to corrupt officials who had facilitated the money laundering, while vehicle manifests revealed smuggling operations that crossed multiple state lines. By dawn, Victory Autohaus stood empty, its showroom windows reflecting the morning sun like the hollow eyes of a corpse. The building that had been the center of a sophisticated criminal enterprise was now just another vacant commercial space waiting for legitimate business to fill the void. But the impact of the investigation would continue for months as federal prosecutors built their cases and victims began the process of seeking compensation. The downfall of Rico Valez and Leo Stax Bernard sent shockwaves through the criminal networks that had assumed they were untouchable. Steven Seagal had proven once again that justice was not just about the law, it was about the willingness of individuals to stand up for what was right regardless of the personal cost. The silent investor had spoken, and his message had been heard clearly by both criminals and victims alike. 3 months after the fall of Victory Autohaus, Steven Seagal sat in a quiet cafe in Santa Monica reading newspaper coverage of the final sentencing hearings. Rico Valez had received 18 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to multiple counts of fraud and money laundering, while Leo Stax Bernard faced life imprisonment under the federal racketeering statutes. His financial empire had been completely dismantled with assets seized and liquidated to compensate victims. The Morning Mail had brought a steady stream of thank you letters from people whose lives had been changed by the investigation. Naomi Brooks had written to tell him that she had received full compensation for her fraudulent vehicle purchase and had used the money to start a nonprofit organization that helped other victims of automotive fraud. Her work was already gaining national attention as consumer advocates recognized the need for better protection against predatory lending practices. Miguel Herrera had sent a photograph of the legitimate auto repair shop he had opened in East Los Angeles using skills learned during his time at Victory Autohaus, but applied to honest work. The shop specialized in helping low-income families maintain their vehicles at affordable prices, and Miggs had hired several other mechanics who had been caught up in the criminal enterprise, giving them a chance to start over with clean records. But it was the letter from Clarence "Pop" Donnelly that carried the most emotional weight. The elderly veteran had written in careful handwriting about how the investigation had restored his faith in justice and given him closure after years of feeling helpless against corporate corruption. Pop had done more than just recover his financial losses. He had become an advocate for elderly consumers, appearing before state legislative committees to push for stronger protections against predatory auto dealers. His war experience had given him credibility with lawmakers, and his plain-spoken testimony had helped pass new regulations that would protect future victims. The ripple effects of the Victory Autohaus investigation continued to spread across the country. Federal authorities had used the evidence to shut down similar operations in multiple states, while international cooperation had led to arrests in Mexico and Canada, where stolen vehicles had been processed through the criminal network. Detective Anya Chun had been promoted to head the fraud division of the Los Angeles Police Department. In recognition of her work on the case, she had established new protocols for investigating automotive fraud and was training officers across the country in techniques for identifying and prosecuting sophisticated criminal enterprises. But for Seagal, the most satisfying outcome was seeing how the victims had transformed their experiences into positive action. Rather than remaining silent about their victimization, they had become advocates for change, using their stories to help others avoid similar traps. The investigation had not just brought criminals to justice, it had empowered ordinary people to fight back against systemic corruption. As he finished reading the newspaper, Seagal noticed a familiar pattern emerging in the business section. A luxury car dealership in San Diego was advertising deals that seemed too good to be true, with financing terms that raised red flags for anyone who understood predatory lending tactics. The advertisements featured testimonials from satisfied customers and promises of guaranteed approval regardless of credit history. Seagal folded the newspaper and paid for his coffee. The work was never finished because greed and corruption were constants in human nature, but so was the capacity for justice and the willingness of ordinary people to stand up for what was right. The investigation at Victory Autohaus had ended, but Steven Seagal's mission continued. Driving south on the Pacific Coast Highway, Seagal reflected on the lessons learned from the case. Organized crime had evolved to exploit legitimate businesses using sophisticated financial instruments and legal loopholes to steal from vulnerable consumers, but the fundamentals of investigation remained the same: patient observation, careful documentation, and the courage to act when action was required. The techniques that had brought down Rico Valez and Leo Stax Bernard could be applied to any situation where power was being abused and justice was being denied, whether it was automotive fraud, corporate corruption, or political malfeasance. The principles remained constant. Truth would always triumph over deception if someone was willing to fight for it. As the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, Seagal thought about the Bronze Star Medal that Pop had shown him and the story of Detective Chen's father who had died because someone put profit ahead of honor. The sacrifice of good people created an obligation for those who survived to continue the fight against corruption in all its forms. The highway stretched ahead, empty and inviting, as Seagal drove toward whatever challenge awaited him in San Diego. He had learned long ago that evil rarely rested, and neither could those who opposed it. The price of justice was eternal vigilance and the willingness to act when others remained silent. Behind him, Los Angeles glittered in the gathering darkness, a city where ordinary people like Naomi Brooks, Miguel Herrera, and Clarence Donnelly had discovered that they possessed more power than they had ever imagined. The investigation had changed them from victims into advocates, from silent sufferers into voices for justice. Victory Autohaus was gone, but its legacy lived on in the strengthened laws that protected consumers, the empowered victims who refused to remain silent, and the knowledge that someone was always watching, ready to step forward when the innocent were threatened by the corrupt. Steven Seagal drove into the night, carrying with him the satisfaction of justice served and the anticipation of justice yet to come. The steel in his character remained uncompromised by time or circumstance, ready to be forged into whatever weapon was needed to protect the innocent from those who would exploit them. The road ahead was uncertain, but the destination was clear. Wherever corruption threatened the innocent, Steven Seagal would be there, watching, waiting, and ready to act with the silent efficiency that had become his trademark. In a world that often mistook quiet strength for weakness, he remained a force for justice that could not be bought, corrupted, or intimidated. The steel shadows had fallen across Victory Autohaus, and justice had emerged victorious. But the real victory was not in the arrests or the convictions. It was in the knowledge that ordinary people possessed extraordinary courage when given the opportunity to stand up for what was right, and that sometimes all they needed was someone willing to show them the way up. Next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.